Hey everyone, CJ here, bringing you another episode of Open the World Map. This time we are joined by Guy Sclanders from How to Be a Great Game Master YouTube channel. Guy was originally from South Africa, but he is currently residing in Tokyo, Japan. So he can tell us what the tabletop RPG scene is like in South Africa and Japan.
Yeah, so can you introduce yourself and tell us more a bit about your background?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for having me in the first place. It's always nice to be invited on these sort of things. Yes. So I'm a game master of many years, almost 30 years now. We're getting there. Definitely over 20 years. Yeah, I'm from South Africa. I'm from a region of South Africa called KwaZulu-Natal, and a specific region in that, which when I was growing up anyway, sort of prided itself on being like this very British, very English bastion. Anyone with knowledge of South Africa's history knows that during the apartheid era, there was a lot of sort of segregation, and the British-speaking fraternity found themselves all sort of in that area simply because it looks a lot like England. So it sort of made sense. Anyway, that's where the accent comes from, because I was raised by my grandparents. Who actually sort of inspired me to join this whole sort of idea of storytelling in the first place. So, yes, I run the channel How to Be a Great GM. We're quite a large channel now, thankfully, which is and our focus is on the narrative side of role playing more than on mechanics. You won't find a video on my channel on the best builds or broken systems. You'll find it on how to create amazing character backstories and.
Has your experience informed you a bit more about how to play certain characters and how would character race affect each other? Because it seems to be more real for you.
I think the biggest challenge really is the player base in South Africa. It's very much skewed towards a minority. From a racial sort of division perspective, and that's really just exposure and accessibility to things. So that's a historical kind of legacy that we have. I think it's definitely changing, and I mean, the hobby itself has changed so much in the last sort of 20 years, which is really when South Africa changed over to democracy. So it's definitely changing. But yes, I suppose so. One of the things that's quite funny is that I'll happily do accents of the Irish or Scottish or French or German or American. But I'm very reluctant to do accents from my own country because of the connotations that sort of sit there. And it's a very sensitive subject. So yes, in general, when we have conventions and things in SA, there's sometimes modules that are set in South Africa. And those modules are often sort of superhero type of things, your District 9 type of film inspired things, Blood Diamond type of thing. And generally they're quite tongue-in-cheek. They don't take themselves very seriously because I think they're a bit too nervous to really push anything serious, if you like, about South Africa as a space. So yeah, I suppose that's been a bit of a change or a bit of an influence, if you like.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that there's a bit of a what's it called, class differences in terms of the interest? Because for right now, there are lots of really good free materials for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. But I'm just kind of wondering, because in some other countries, the people I've spoken to say more people are playing it in cafes, in tabletop games cafe instead of a game shop, because most of the time they are unable to afford the product itself. So I guess they'll just go to a place where they can share the hobby.
So South Africa, I can only speak from my experience. So you might find another South African who has quite a different experience. But when I was growing up, I was exposed to Dungeons and Dragons. And the way that I was exposed to that was through a catalogue, a printed catalogue that a friend happened to have. And my first books I ordered from America via a postal letter that I had to write out, and I had to enclose special sort of traveler's checks, because there was quite literally only one retailer in the whole country who actually stocked that material. And that was in one town, which is on the other side of the country from where I grew up anyway. And even as the interest factor has included, I then moved to the bigger city about 15 years ago. And even there are only maybe 4 or 5 stores that actually stock role-playing products. So it's not a case, it's the legacy is accessibility. We just didn't have retailers who had the product to sell in the first place. So a lot of people only accessed it through sort of an old copy of a friend who happened to have got it while they were overseas, or who had done like I had done and sort of ordered it in. And of course, with the advent of the internet, then suddenly people start to find alternative sources, to put it politely, of sort of reference material and stuff. And you've got to also remember that a standard role-playing book, let's say it retails for about $40 US. For most of the South African population, $40 US is like 3 or 4 days worth of food. So it's almost a week's salary type of thing for a lot of the population, because the population is also, the vast majority are very, very poor. There's a huge difference between the classes, as you were saying, and it's not so much a case of lack of desire. At South Africa, the people of Africa are great storytellers and are spellbinding when they tell stories. It's more a case of exposure. As a good example, my mother's a school teacher, and during the transition, because during apartheid there was 2 very separate education systems. There was one education system for the general population, which was the black population, and there's another education system for the white population. And they were very different, and they were very purposefully different to maintain control and all that sort of thing. So during the transitionary period where South Africa has now changed, the curriculum has to change. Now, as an example, and this is sort of how it links into role-playing, my mother teaches grade 2. And for the longest time in grade 2, part of the syllabus was a section on pirates. Now, we're not talking about the bloodthirsty side of pirates and the prisoners and the cat and nine tails. We're talking about, happy little pirates sailing around in the ocean on their little boats, pirate treasure chests, the fantasy side of pirates. They had to take that out of the curriculum because the vast majority of the population, although South Africa has coastline on 3 sides of it, the vast majority did not know what the ocean was, simply because they'd never been on holiday to go there. They didn't have the financial resources to actually go to the coast to experience the ocean. They didn't have television to be exposed to the idea of pirates. So there's that big rift where we have this large chunk of a very separate type of thinking from the Western-inspired base, if you like. You can't role play Dungeons and Dragons if you don't know what an elf is or what a dwarf is. You need to approach that with a certain open-mindedness, right? That and free time. There's not a huge amount of free time. A lot of the population spend a lot of time in transit. South Africa doesn't have a fantastic subway system or anything like that. So a lot of people spend a lot of time in traffic. I mean, I used to spend an hour every day getting to and from work, and I had my own private vehicle. So suddenly your free time becomes very, very precious as well. Anyway, so those are some of the limitations. As far as getting together in clubs and that sort of thing, that's a totally foreign concept in South Africa anyway. Again, you've got 5, maybe 6 stores in the whole country that stock these books, let alone that would have the space to support them. Now, South Africans are very, very sociable people. And I'm now in Tokyo, and it's one of the things that's killing me about being in Japan is that I expect my friends to come over every second or third day and hang out in the house. And every weekend, it's a barbecue, it's this, it's that, it's the next thing, and it's role-playing. So you role-play in your own houses, your own spaces. And what that actually caused was when I moved from my home city to the biggest city in South Africa, to Johannesburg, I couldn't find a group to role play with. Now, we had the internet. This was 2010. So we had internet, we had all of those sort of social meetups and that sort of thing. I couldn't find a group because they were all so cliquey that they all had their people, they all had their players, so they didn't need anyone. So we actually formed a group called the Foreign Legion, which was literally all of the people who had moved to Johannesburg who didn't have local Johannesburg friends. So we had someone from Cape Town, we had an American, we had someone from, other little outlying cities. We got together and formed a group. And then when people tried to join our group, we said, well, I'm sorry, we're full. And that was it. So there was a lot of very sort of small little groups everywhere playing one or two systems, and that was about it. But it has started to change. There's now stores that are starting to open up. There's some fantastic support now, obviously, coming through. We've seen the number of conventions grow from 1 a year to like 7 or 8 or 9. I forget. I've sort of lost count.
Excellent.
And that's literally in the last what, sort of 8 years or so. This massive growth.
What you've said is what you previously said is pretty interesting. It's like sometimes people can't wrap their head around certain concept that they are not familiar with, like elves and dwarves and so on. And sometimes I do have that sort of like a difference in point of reference when I'm playing with some of my players, because some of them are introduced towards to fantasy from the Japanese animation side, the manga and anime. Their elves are a bit different from what we are used to in like Lord of the Rings and other things like that. Maybe Conan the Barbarians. And when they role play with each other, it's like there is lots of like conflict with each other's expectation. It's like, well, that's not what elves are supposed to do, and things like that. Yeah. So do you think it's a problem in your game too when that sort of things happen?
Well, so yeah, it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. Look, in South Africa, the general role-playing community, and I use this with very, very broad strokes, but the general role-playing community that I've experienced, all come from a very similar background. We all have a good knowledge of, say, Tolkien. So we all know Lord of the Rings. We all know The Hobbit. So there's that. So our pool of storytelling, of myth making, is a very, very European pool. So from that perspective, we link together. Now, where that starts to fall apart, and I will never forget, and I hate to go back to it, but it is a definite and it's a real influence on role playing, is when I first, when apartheid finished, what happened was we had different schools for the different races. And the government obviously had to readdress that and to stop segregating based on that. So we started to integrate, and we started to commingle with black students. And we had a challenge because, now, I mean, this was 1996, 95, somewhere around there. So this was a long time ago. But we had a challenge. We wanted to put on a play based on Robin Hood and his merry men. And the black students hadn't a clue who that was, because he hadn't been part of their upbringing, hadn't been part of their culture. So I remember very badly being very frustrated and going to the English teacher saying, "Oh, I can't work with I think his name was Sipo. Sipo, it was Sipo, I think. Anyway, I can't work with him. He doesn't even know who Robin Hood is." And she explained to me. She said, "Well, sure, but do you know who?" And that's a character from one of the African groups, anyway, from one of the northern groups, as a character who had great power and great influence. So it was about then started to realize, oh, hang on a moment, there is a different perspective. And you're right, coming out here to Japan, absolutely, there's a completely different experience where you mentioned Tolkien and things, and people don't know that. But I've even experienced on my channel where I reference, like in Sauron from Lord of the Rings, he did this and he did that. And I have people who watch my channel, I have no idea what their demographic is. And they type and they go, I haven't read or watched Lord of the Rings, so I don't know who that is. And I go, how can you not have watched Lord of the Rings? It came out, it came out almost 20 years ago, 2001. And you go, oh, yes, right, yes. So there are actually people alive who were born after that movie was made, let alone, and they're not going to go back and watch it necessarily. So I think it's a class thing, but I think it's an age thing as well. As you get older, it's referencing material that you grew up with, type of thing. So
and it's like okay, so now with the way they play in Africa, I know that lots of my South African friends, they speak excellent English and everything like that, but they also mentioned that, usually they speak Afrikaans in South Africa. So is it like a different sort of English, or I'm not quite sure what's the difference? Do they play in Afrikaans, or do they just use English completely when they play games?
Well, well, firstly, my Afrikaans is abysmal. I only studied it in school, and as I said, I grew up in a very English area. So the Afrikaans teacher was fighting a losing battle uphill at a very difficult time for Afrikaans. Anyway, so I have to laugh because the biggest convention for role playing in South Africa, which is 27 years or 26 years, Grant will have to forgive me, Grant and Les, but anyway, it's the biggest role playing convention in South Africa. They started a thing where you would come and you'd role play, and it was competitive role playing. It was absolutely fantastic. It actually was the reason why I started my YouTube channel. And then they brought in comedians for sort of evening entertainment. And this one comedian came in, his name is Melt. I won't try pronounce his surname, it'll insult a whole bunch of people. But Melt came in, and he is very Afrikaans. And he was saying he now has to do this entire comedy sketch thing in English. And it's very intimidating for him because it's not his first language. I've never experienced role-playing in any other language other than English in South Africa. I will have to ask some very Afrikaans friends of mine whether they do that or not. What I can tell you, though, is I suspect that it's not likely. Of the few role-playing systems that I know of that have been written in South Africa and published, they're all written in English. So I know that friends of mine from Germany, they have difficulty role-playing in German because all the material's in English. So you spend most of your time referencing English terms. So then you just drop your local language and you just adopt English as your form of conversation. Certainly, the South African words will creep into the language. So, South African words can be Afrikaans, they can be Zulu, they can be Xhosa, they can be Sotho. It doesn't matter where they come from. They've just become part of the everyday sort of lexicon of words that we use. So I think that can happen. But I've never experienced a game in any other language.
Okay. Yeah, and it's also very interesting because, I'm based in Australia, Melbourne, Australia. I've spoken to some game creators and even like game masters in Australia. He says that it is very difficult using the Australian accent for any character that he plays because, nobody in the fantasy world speak Australian English with Australian accent.
That's interesting. He hasn't met my goblins. All right.
Actually, you have said that there are also South African role-playing games. Games.
There are a few systems that I'm definitely aware of. There's a gentleman named Chris Visser. He's very prolific in writing these very sort of small, self-contained kind of systems. He and another chap, John Murray. Now I'm questioning, is that his real name? Yes, it is. Anyway, they've written quite a few systems, mainly for live action role playing, as well as for tabletop role playing. I know Chris has sent me another thing now. Anyway, so the systems they write, though, are all very European-centric in terms of their approach. So they're Cthulhu-esque or they're traditional fantasy, and we're sort of talking sword and sorcery type of fantasy. There really isn't a focus on African, the African mythology, the African mythos. And I stand to be horribly corrected here, but there's quite an important reason for that. Is that South Africa, the police force, the police department, still has a special unit for magic crimes.
What?
So South Africans in general are quite superstitious. So if you go and research, if you go and look up something called a Tokoloshe or a Tokoloshe,
What is that?
It's a diminutive, demonic little creature of evil that gets summoned up by a witch doctor to cause havoc in one's life. So your bed in your house, for example, must always be raised off of the ground. You don't sleep on the floor. Because if you sleep on the floor, the Tokoloshe can come along and he'll cut your throat, or he'll infect you with the poison, or he'll do whatever he needs to do. So the fact that South Africa still has active practicing witch doctors who cast the bones to foresee the future, who use herbal medicine as remedy, and they're not a small group. They are still very much in the public space. There is still this very strong sense of superstitious of magic itself. Right. So when we as South Africans sort of approach it, there is a certain awareness that you're basically, it would be like writing a role-playing game set in the Catholic priesthood, except perhaps with less irreverence, because the Catholics are in the public eye, and they're always taking flack for all sorts of things. But so there's a certain amount of, oh yeah, we can rip them off. Whereas here, this is something that's very real to a lot of the population, right. And a lot of that population would take something like that very, very seriously, and would see it as an affront or a mockery, if you like, of that. Again, though, that's my impressions. And the sad thing is,
it gives a flashback to the satanic panic in America, isn't it? Do you think it's going to cause something like that with D&D?
I don't think it would be. Well, it certainly could be. I think it would be more a case of cultural misappropriation, making fun of something that people take very seriously and making fun of that. So, the other side of the coin is that there was a book called Africa, My Children, which was written by a traditional medicine healer, a Sangoma, they called in South Africa. And the Sangoma broke one of the fundamental laws of that entire group of people insofar as committing their oral history to paper. Now, when you read that book, I was lucky enough to have a copy of that book, and I read that book. That's the origin stories of the Nguni-speaking people, which is a large group of people that includes the Xhosas, the Xhosas, the Zulus, and that sort of thing, the different tribal groups within South Africa. It's the origin stories, it's creation myths, it's legends, and the legends and creation myths are fantastically wonderful. I mean, they're as creative as anything that steps out of Greek mythology or Egyptian Egyptology and that sort of thing. So there's a definite wealth there. Like I said, it's a nation that storytelling is part of it, but at the same time, there's a reverence for it that doesn't yet allow us, I don't think anyway, to get in there and expose it and make a system out of it. Right. And then you look at the other two sides of it. You've got the British background, so that just takes us straight back to Tolkien and company. Or you've got the Afrikaans side, and they're they are or were originally Dutch settlers. Right. So they still bring in the Germanic background, that sort of those stories. So yeah, that's where we stand, I suppose.
Okay, right. And you said you mentioned Call of Cthulhu a few times. What other tabletop RPG games are popular in South Africa besides Dungeons and Dragons?
Right. Yes. So obviously Dungeons and Dragons proliferates. I think that's also, it's a legacy thing. People have been playing it forever. It's been around for a long time. Pathfinder had quite a big impact for a while. I'm assuming Pathfinder 2 is going to do similar types of things. Again, it's a big cost factor. $50 for most South Africans is quite a commitment. Doesn't matter what social strata you're in. So there is that factor. Pathfinder, obviously Call of Cthulhu, 7th Sea. Generally, those are the things sort of battering around. Warhammer 40K is quite popular. I'm just sort of thinking of the various modules that get written for these role-playing conventions, the popular ones. Yeah, generally it's that kind of space. Pathfinder Society took off quite a lot in SA. Simply because I think there is that online space, that online community that came about. So those are the kind of the main ones. I hate to be the voice of it, because I kind of really, I didn't dig my heels in it, but I didn't really explore much elsewhere. You know, if I look at my shelf here of the role-playing books that I brought, there's D&D, there's D20 Modern, which I thought was one of the best D20 systems ever written. There's Cthulhu, there's Pathfinder, there's some Star Trek stuff, which I absolutely love. Star Wars obviously also features quite heavily in that mixture. Star Wars is very big in SA, so I think that's sort of a space that I don't think would ever compete with Dungeons and Dragons, but it's definitely a space.